Welcome to the Acquivore podcast. I'm your host, Don Mansfield from Don Acquisition LLC. I'm joined here with Jennifer Townsend from Contracting Courses and Nick the Sandman Sanders from Apogee Consulting. We have a lot to get to in today's show. At any time, if you feel you have a question, go ahead and ask it. Use the buttons at the top of the screen, and you can raise your hand. Your video is enabled, and if you have anything to say, we will enable your microphones. But for now, we ask you to stay on mute. So the first thing is we'll go through a little bit of introductions for you. My background is government contracting for coming on 26 years, most of which I was with the Department of Defense and the Department of the DAU for the last 13 as a contracts professor. And I recently, about 2 years ago, moved to industry, and I also do some training. My business is donacquisition.com, which I'll show you right here. You see the website okay? So there's donacquisition.com, and I teach courses in all sorts of things in government contracting. My leading courses are the DFARS course and the Simplifies Acquisition Procedures course. But I also teach others, and you can find out all about my courses on my website. Jennifer, do you want to say a little bit about contracting courses?
Sure. My name is Jennifer Townsend, and I also worked in government contracting for well, I still do, but I worked for the government in government contracting for 23 years and am now doing my own business. So the business I've started is contracting courses. Okay, somehow this feedback situation is resolving. So I wonder if Nick mutes himself, because I think that's part of what's happening. Yes. Yeah, I think whenever there's 3 microphones, that will be an issue. Yeah, okay. Unless there's a headset involved. In any case, I worked for just to go back a little bit more to my experience, I worked for the Navy for the first part of my career, which is actually when I met Don Acquisition. We worked together for a couple of years, and then I worked for the
Adjacent cubicles.
Yes. I worked for the Defense Acquisition University for a couple of years, about 5 years, and in fact, I asked Don to come work at Defense Acquisition University because I thought he would be a huge asset to DAU, and he definitely was a huge asset. It was a big loss to DAU when he departed. And then I also worked for the Department of Defense Education Activity in the 4th Estate for a couple of years, and then I worked for the Army for a couple of years, and so been around a little bit, and now I'm providing training. The courses I'm initially offering are on contract clauses and on commercial item contracting, which includes services. So you can find me at contractingcourses.com, which Don has pulled up there. All right. Thank you.
All right, Nick, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Nick Sanders here, founder and principal consultant of Apogee Consulting. And you can find me at www.apogeeconsulting.biz. And what Don is showing now is my website. The most prominent feature, of course, is my blog. I've been running a blog now for more than 11 years. Turns out there's basically more than 1 million words that I've written on aspects of government contracting over that period, actually documenting a lot of the changes that have happened over the last decade. My background is all government contracting, but never with the government, always on the contractor side or a subcontractor side. Not only DoD, but Department of Energy, EPA, other civilian agencies. And primarily, I dealt with a lot of the cost accounting matters and the billing matters and the pricing matters. But in addition to that, I've also done procurement and prime contract administration on behalf of contractors. And Don and I team taught a course just a little more than a year ago, right, Don? We were hired to go to England, Newcastle, in January, which wasn't as cold as I thought it was going to be, actually. It was quite pleasant some nights. And I really enjoyed teaching with Don. I'm more of a consultant, I think, than a teacher. I'm happy to do training for clients, but really what I tend to be hired to do is work out things like how to get to an adequate accounting system, how to get an adequate estimating or purchasing system, how to deal with DCAA when they go rogue. So that kind of stuff. And I've been doing this a very long time. Let's just say when I started, Reagan was president. So that's my story.
All right. Thanks, Nick. So Nick is the guy I rely on to get the contractor's perspective of things. We make a lot of assumptions in the government of what it's like to be a contractor. And when I talk to Nick, I find out a lot of those assumptions are wrong. So Nick's input's always very valuable. Expert when it comes to cost and pricing and cost accounting type stuff. So we're happy to have him. Jennifer, longtime friend, great colleague, and one of the more knowledgeable people you'll find out there, and great instructor. So the first thing that we're going to cover today is Nick wrote a blog piece on his website. Why won't contracting officers settle question direct costs? So Nick, you want to give us a little background on the issue you're writing about?
Yes, let me do my best. This is a weird phenomenon I've noticed over the years. The DoD Inspector General likes to take pot shots at DCMA contracting officers. I don't exactly know why that is the case, but this is another in a continuing series of Inspector General reports that have salacious headlines or conclusions that when you look at it, it all kind of falls apart. And I don't want to disparage the Inspector General because they do an important job and it's a tough job, but this is the kind of audit report I would not have let go out under my name. We'll just say it like that. So the background here is the DoD IG evaluates contracting officers in a number of areas, and the one they've picked recently is DCMA contracting officers' disposition of DCAA, Defense Contract Audit Agency, audit reports. So you want me to keep going, Don, and talking about it? Yeah, so in this case, you need to know a lot of stuff here, right? I mean, it's a complex issue. And I wouldn't even say I know all the stuff. It has to do with something called a CAO, a Contract Administration Office. Oh, I don't find CAO anywhere in the FAR. I mean, actually, there is a little section of the FAR that talks about CAO, but it doesn't talk about what functions or activities necessarily make up a CAO. And what I'm gathering, and Don and Jennifer, please jump in on this, there's a PCO, and once the contract is awarded, apparently the PCO is supposed to assign some or all of these contract administration functions to this CAO.
Right.
Is the PCO of the CAO? I can't figure that out. And you guys should tell me.
Usually
But
no.
so
So
we're starting with, there's all these different contracting officers and they all do different things. And the IG is talking about why don't they all do everything?
right.
Over to you guys for comment.
So the CAO, I don't know if anybody uses that term outside of the FAR, but it is a thing. It's defined in Part 2. And 42302 has all those contract administration functions. And there's like 60 or 70 of them listed in the FAR. The PCO, which is actually not a term in the FAR, PCO, but most people use that to refer to the procuring contracting officer or the contracting officer that awards the contract. When they award a contract, they have to plan for who's going to do the administration. And that can be, they could retain it, or they can delegate it. If they delegate it, then if it's just like a blanket delegation, then the contract administration office would take over all these functions in the FAR. Now, having said that, there are some functions that that cannot be retained, and I think you pointed it out in your blog. For example, dealing with cost accounting standards, resolving those issues, negotiating forward pricing rate agreements, doing system reviews, things like that. So that's going to be done by the contract administration office regardless, because we don't want every PCO from everywhere doing these types of reviews. So Jennifer, do you have anything to add to that? Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yes, sorry, I accidentally raised my hand when I was trying to unmute. Anyways, so I think you're right on the money there. I suspect there's a little bit more that happened here over the years. I actually thought about this yesterday when Nick had said that he was hired during the Reagan years. Don and I were actually hired after the hiring freeze, I think that Reagan had put in. And I think there was this fairly lengthy hiring freeze that precluded hiring a fair number of contract specialists during the during that period of time. And so in my opinion, this is related because during that same period of time, there were a fair chunk of contract administration offices that were the precursor of DC MA, and they weren't just used by DCMA, they were also used by NASA and some of the other larger agencies, because DoD had this function with these larger contractors that also did business with other agencies. And so when the FAR was rewritten, I think that some of this stuff got sucked into the FAR without people realizing that there wasn't a very clear discussion about this. And I think also related to that was this idea of these large defense contractors versus these smaller defense contractors, major systems types acquisition, which now has morphed into more of these large services contracts. So to be clear, what I'm trying to say is the current FAR coverage is certainly not very clear. The DFAR's coverage is a little bit more clear. And while you might say, well, that's specific to DoD, my experience and the reality is that the civilian agencies try to use DCMA as much as they possibly can. Due to more budget constraints, they haven't been able to recently. But certainly the guidance is that if DCMA has, in fact, performed any of these functions, especially the ones that are retained, the ones that deal with the corporate entity, that they definitely share their findings and their outcomes with the entire federal government contracting workforce, if that makes sense. So hopefully that kind of helps put a little bit into perspective.
So what was the issue that the IG uncovered, Nick?
Okay, I'm going to get into that, but I do want to respond. I mean, that's all good background. I think it's important to know this stuff. But from my perspective as a contractor, it's hard to figure this all out. There's an ACO, right? But if you're big enough, you have multiple ACOs.
If what?
Right? Like you might have an Army ACO and an Air Force ACO and a Navy ACO. And then there's an ACO supervisor, which I don't know what that is. And then there's something called a DACO, divisional ACO. And that's a pretty common term, but it's hard to figure out exactly what the roles and responsibilities are of a DACO versus your garden variety ACO or administrative contracting officer. And then if you're really big, if you're one of the top 10, you have a CACO, right? Have a corporate administrative contracting officer. So the fundamental thing is these roles are kind of blurry from my perspective as a contractor. And I actually challenged once a DACO to say, please explain to me what your authority is and what your roles and responsibilities are, citing to regulation.
And
cannot do it, right? Cannot do it. So anyway, I think this is really important background. It's confusing. Maybe, and by the way, Jennifer, I love your reference. I think, wasn't it called DCASPRO or DCASMA? There was a plant representative office back in the day. Oh my God, we're going back to ancient days. Service validation of IRAD limits. I mean, good times, good times. Thank God those days are over, but still. But it's really confusing for me as a contractor. It's really confusing trying to figure out who's got what authority. It's not clear. And as we all know, I'm supposed to make sure the government people have authority before I accept direction.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Well, I think that if I were a contractor, I'm looking at the cover page of the award document to see who the contract is administered by. So that at least gives me the identity of the office. Okay. Now, as far as a specific individual, I'm not sure how to do that. There used to be a something online where you could enter in your cage code and it would tell you who the contract management team was. But I think DCMA has put that behind their firewall now. So I don't know how to officially tell who your ACO. Go ahead, Jennifer.
So just to give a little bit of background on this, I think a little bit of what Nick said as well as what you said is the DACO function is fairly well defined, and I can't remember, I should have looked this up ahead of time, but in the DFARS or the DFARS PG&I, and it's a divisional administrative contracting officer, whereas the CACO is the corporate. And so the reason you would have a DACO is because there are, especially on these large government contracts, there's divisions that are separate, and they have separate accounting systems, for instance, than other divisions. And so that's essentially the main difference between a DACO and a CACO. So a DACO is authorized to make divisions, make authoritative decisions for the division, but is not authorized to make authoritative decisions for the corporate. Now, a normal and as far as when someone is assigned to be a DACO by DCMA and when someone is assigned to be a CACO, that part is not as clear. That's internal DCMA guidance. And some of the reason I again strongly suspect that there's confusion, even on the part of DCMA DACOs and hopefully no CACOs. But I think some of the reason there's some confusion is because DCMA underwent a series of, and this goes back to that DCAS and, you know, all of these precursors, but sometime in the, around 2000 time period, and the whole time, like 2000 to 2005, the time that I was teaching at DAU, DCMA decided to realign their entire structure very, very differently from how it had historically been. Unfortunately, the people who were in management at DCMA at that period of time had no clear understanding of how critical that role of DACO and CACO and ACO were to these functions. Some of it was because of the rise of commercial contracting, and there was far less, you know, cost reimbursement. You know, a number of things contributed to that. But as a result, a core expertise within DCMA and a core historical perspective and knowledge, I think, was lost. And so DCMA, it was only a matter of time before it caught up to them. And then they realized that, oh, we have to do these functions. And I actually had, when I was working for the Army, I had the pleasure and horror, I shouldn't use those two words together, but the head of DCMA was speaking at that point in time because I had been wondering why the Army was duplicating DCMA functions completely unnecessarily and in my mind inappropriately, because, you know, you can't, the Army couldn't have a contracting officer go out and tell like one of the top 10 contractors that their government property system was unacceptable when DCMA had already declared it acceptable. That's just not how it works. And so anyway, the DCMA commander had been invited to speak at this Army leadership conference, contracting leadership conference that I was at. And he was sharing that they still had a very, very tight budget. There was, you know, kind of a cap on manpower. And so they had to very much pick and choose which of their even DoD, DFARS assigned contract administration functions they could actually perform. So, and I think that's part of why there's this very bizarre situation now where you've got the IG, you know, leveling some criticisms that probably may or may not be merited, but to some degree, DCMA almost invites that, I shouldn't say invites that criticism because I certainly don't think they relish it, but I think they could use that as a tool to try and increase their hiring. So it's not always a bad thing when the IG criticizes you, whether they're on the mark or not.
So I think
those are good points.
So I think once a delegation goes over to an ACO, I think they would delegate certain functions to the DACO, right? And I don't know if a contractor knows what those delegations are. It might be in like a DCMA instruction or something, who does what. I did find a very old form. Let's see. This is a form that I actually used to use when I was a contract administrator. And this is when a contract administration office is assigned contract administration and then internally delegates functions. So if I'm an ACO, I'm going to delegate property administration to the organization's property administrator. I'll delegate plant clearance to the plant clearance officer. Contract termination, if that's necessary. And I think other would be something like settling indirect rates, resolving CAS issues. And that would be something that would go over to the DACO.
My understanding is slightly different. I think what I understand is that because DCMA for a while during that whole reorg period, that type in your cage code and figure out who your ACO, cognizant ACO is. The link was still in the FAR, the DFARs, but it wasn't, functional. But they finally kind of got it back functional again. Again, I'm not sure if it's behind that firewall, but if it is, the contractor absolutely should be able to contact the contracting officer on their procuring contracting officer and demand to know who specifically the ACO is. And I think that I don't think it necessarily varies. I don't think an ACO delegates functions to a DACO, if that makes sense. I think once you've been assigned a DACO, that's your DACO period for that contract. And the DACO though does then delegate, because within DCMA they actually have 1103s who do the property administration. They have plant clearance officers who do that function as well. They have in some cases termination contracting officers and so on. So I think that's certainly that's my understanding of how it works, but I think that's why it varies from time to time, because a particular ACO may or may not have the option to delegate to an 1103, or they may have to do it themselves. It depends it goes back to that staffing model. Hopefully that helps.
Mm-hmm. So what else do we need to know about the report, Nick?
Okay, well, in case people...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Dan.
Go say what you're saying.
So, people who are watching this podcast are like, when are you going to get back to the IG audit report? But this is all relevant because this is the IG's criticism. They just call them contracting officers, right? And you're right, Jennifer, there was a reaction in the early 00s. I think it was a reaction to the Kelman give contracting officers discretion, and then there was a rebound from that. But, the pendulum swung pretty far. And I think there was actually some audit reports where DCMA leadership even admitted that they'd lost critical skill sets because of that. It was out there in the public that they were ruining the day, that they let people go and had the hiring freeze and all that stuff. And Don, you're right. There is a DoD instruction, a DCMA instruction called 2201-03 that the IG hangs their whole hat on, right? So according to this instruction, which isn't in the FAR, isn't in the DFARs, it's a DCMA instruction, the DACO settles indirect question costs, right? Because they're supposed to settle the indirect rates. The ACO, on the other hand, by the manual, is the one who's supposed to settle the direct costs that are questioned by audit. So you have these different functions, different people, maybe in the same office, I don't know, and the IG said, well, you've got this audit report, and as contracting officers know, the audit report goes into the CAFU, right? Contract audit follow-up database, where the clock starts ticking. The contracting officers have to disposition the audit findings within a certain time. Otherwise, they get on a report that goes to headquarters. So you got this report in CAFU, and indeed, the DACO settled the indirect costs. The DACO did the job, but the ACO didn't do it. And so the IG says two things. One, by the manual, by the instruction, the DACO is supposed to coordinate the ACOs, plural, right? Because there could be more than one ACO. So the DACO didn't coordinate. The audit report was dispositioned in CAFU without the coordination. And two, they said, well, DACO, if you knew the ACO wasn't going to settle, why didn't you settle it? Right? And that's the key thing. They lump them all together. They say, you're all contracting officers. Why didn't you get it? That's the whole genesis, the whole central thesis of the IG. The DACO dispositioned the audit report in the CAFU, but the ACO hadn't actually settled the direct costs as required. Therefore, it looked like everything was fine when it wasn't. And as a result, perhaps $300 million of allegedly unallowable costs may have been reimbursed to the contractor. And isn't that a scandal of all epic proportions? Right? So that's the key thing. It's this confusion. And that's why all this discussion, we just spent a half an hour talking about it, and we even disagreed with each other about certain points. This confusion lets the IG come in and criticize DCMA contracting officers.
Fodder for the IGs. I thought it was interesting, the IG, they referenced the FAR, the part of the FAR that says if a policy or procedure isn't illegal or against regulation, you can assume it's okay. And they were like, well, why didn't the DACOs settle direct costs based on that? Like, well, maybe because they didn't have that authority or responsibility within their organization.
Well, some of this, I think, goes back to a knowledge situation, which when I very first was working with cost reimbursement contracts, I was, again, like horrified to read FAR Part 42, because we consistently said in our office, we retain contracts for administration. And so I read FAR Part 42 and read all those, and I was assigned contracts to administer, and I read those, and I'm like, well, I'm not doing these things, so we're not doing this. And so, of course, I had several discussions with my main team lead contracting officer at the time about this, and this was even, when there was still substantially more skill set associated with cost reimbursement contracts in the government than I think there is now. But she was very unclear on kind of, hey, what is the ACO doing that we're, are we saying when we retain administration, are we, in the Navy, in this office, saying that we are going to, do these audits, settle indirect costs, and so on. And then that's when, I started to dive down this situation in the first place. But I think, again, like fast forward to today, we have my experience has been, and I saw cost reimbursement contracting in several locations as a higher level manager, and again had some experience in discussing with DCMA. My experience is that the reason the IG is pinning it on DCMA is because they can't cite every single contracting officer that has a contract out there that's cost reimbursement, and so they're putting it onto DCMA. But DCMA have the expertise they have. The reason they're an ACO in these contracts pretty much these days is because they have that cost expertise and that familiarity with the contractor. What they don't have is any kind of expertise really on what the government is buying, unless it's one of these major systems where they've got dedicated people looking at it, which frankly aren't that many of our cost reimbursement contracts. Most of our cost reimbursement contracts today are services, and so DCMA is not, they don't consider themselves, nor should they be in a position to judge whether, I'm just picking an example out of a hat, but whether 50 lawnmowers is prudent for that particular acquisition as a direct cost, or if it should be 10 lawnmowers. And believe it or not, I know that sounds very silly to use groundskeeping as a cost reimbursement example, but there are agencies that do use cost reimbursement for groundskeeping for various reasons. Which is a whole separate discussion. But I think that's really the key factor here is it's pinned on DCMA, even though it really should be pinned on every ACO with the expertise. But for lack of being able to cite, Army, Navy, Air Force, every component in DoD, contracting officers, that's why they say kind of DoD, but they're pinning it on DCMA because when there is a cost reimbursement, according to DoD policy, they own, cost settlement. And so what they want is for DCMA to do that coordination with whomever the particular ACO is. again, just to opine, my own experiences is when they would send it to the contracting officer on the procuring side will send it to their technical expert who may or may not have a good idea if those are a good cost or not. So I think the underlying issue here is that we don't know what we're buying and no one's really an expert. And so, it takes a while to look at those direct costs and figure out, is this prudent for this effort? And in theory, the only people who know that are, in fact, the PCOs and or their the requirements activity, the technical expert or the customer.
So it looks like the DCMA director, he disagreed with a finding that the FAR grants DCMA contracting officers the authority to settle or negotiate DCA question direct costs. The DCMA director stated that DCMA ACOs and DACOs are limited to establishing final indirect cost and billing rates. I thought I saw one of those items on that list of things that can be delegated, settling indirect costs. Let me bring that up. I'm not sure I agree with the DCMA director on that one. Okay, so here's one of the things that get delegated. Determine the allowability of costs suspended or disapproved as required. Direct the suspension or disapproval of costs when there is reason to believe they should be suspended or disapproved, and approve final vouchers. Yeah, I guess it doesn't say settle the direct costs, but hold that thought because I did find something in 42.8 on settlement of indirect costs, of direct costs. So 42.8 is disallowance of costs. And it talks about the notice of intent to disallow costs. At any time during performance of a contract of a type referred to in 42802, which is cost reimbursement, fixed price incentive, etc., the cognizant contracting officer responsible for administering the contract may issue the contractor a written notice of intent to disallow specified costs incurred or planned for occurrence. However, before issuing the notice, the contracting officer responsible for administering the contract shall make every reasonable effort to reach a satisfactory settlement through discussions with the contractor. So I think that allows, if a contract is delegated for administration, then this, I think, gives them authority to settle any kind of disallowed costs. What do you think?
Yeah, with what you just said, but I think specifically going back to the IG audit report, they did reference this DCMA manual 2201-003, which I haven't read, but they did say if you read this manual, it says when the PCO delegates or assigns authority to the contract administration office, the ACO is responsible for settling question direct cost, and the DACO is responsible for settling question indirect cost, because questioning indirect cost is part of settling the final billing rates, right? That was my interpretation of the whole thing. But it's a hairball complicated, right? Especially from the outside, if you're a contractor, like, who am I dealing with and why? But the issue here, this is where I think the IG really made a mistake. They missed the boat entirely. The issue is not what the manual says, and it's not what the FAR says necessarily. The issue is, what does the allowable cost and payment clause say? 52206-7. Now, this is something that the Section 809 panel, remember them, Section 809 panel from a couple of years ago? They tackled this. And they said to DCAA, you're doing 2 audits with 1 audit report. If you look at the allowable cost and payment clause, settling rates to create the movement from a provisional billing rate to a final billing rate is covered by 1 section of the clause. And the settlement of direct cost when questioned by a contracting officer is covered by a different section of the clause, paragraph, whatever the, Jennifer, you have to tell me what the correct terminology is, but I think D is indirect and G is direct, if I'm not mistaken from my memory. So they said, DCAA, you're doing 2 audit reports and you're issuing it in 1 bundle. That's the source of the problem, in my view. If DCAA did 2 audit reports and 1 was addressed to the DACO and 1 was addressed to the cognizant ACO, you wouldn't have 1 audit report being disposition and CAFU. You'd have 2 with 2 separate contracting officers being responsible for it. The IG, in my view, the IG completely missed that. And by the way, for some reason, DCMA or DCAA has not accepted that Section 809 recommendation, which would have solved this problem. If I had been the director of DCMA, I definitely would have put that in there, saying, well, if we could get this clause, if we could get DCAA to follow the clause requirements in their audit report, we'd have an easier time complying. Anyway.
All right.
I think just to comment on some of that, I think there's a larger underlying issue, which I think Nick has hit on, but I would go a step farther than what the Section 809 panel suggested, because what they're doing is, I hate to say it's like pin the tail on the donkey, but speaking colloquially, that like the 809 panel said, well, hey, let's pin this on DCAA and let's have DCAA issue 2 audit reports. And then this goes back to DCAA is also under a budget crunch. And in fact, they got so behind on audits that they had to restrict whatever audits. And then, you know, DoD, within DoD, I don't know if you knew this, Nick, but within DoD, they were creating these top 10 lists to focus DCAA's limited time and capabilities onto. And we would do this, we would have this data call. I'm not sure if Don even saw these at DAU, but we would get a data call on a somewhat regular basis asking what our top 10 audit priorities were for DCAA, and then we would push those up the chain, and at increasingly higher levels, they would, you know, winnow it down to weigh this audit priority within, you know, say, the entire Navy against this audit report, you know, priority, and then at the DPAP level, they would have the top 10 for DCAA. And so the underlying issue, and what the IG is certainly getting at, is, you know, we are spending taxpayer money, which in theory there's not an unlimited supply of taxpayer money, and so, you know, should we be paying unreasonable rates to contractors? And the question then becomes, well, who's determining whether it's unreasonable? Is it DCMA or is it DCAA or is it the procuring contracting officer? And I think that, you know, IG keeps trying to pin it on someone, and no matter who it is, someone should in fact take the responsibility. While the bulk of contractors are in fact, you know, honest and charge, you know, appropriately and are prepared to withstand an audit, sadly there are other contractors who are unfortunately not honest, and they overcharge, and, you know, in some cases perhaps even create work that they didn't do out of thin air and submit invoices for that. And so whose job is it to, well, and this is exactly why everybody wants to get away from cost reimbursement contracts, but unless you can clearly define a requirement sufficient that a contractor can take over that risk, there's no way you can get away from cost reimbursement contracting. And so the question is, when you do a cost reimbursement contract, do you in fact have the resources to properly administer it? And properly administering it, whether it's, you know, the ACO or the, you know, PCO or the DACO or the auditor at DCAA properly administering a government cost reimbursement contract involves reviewing direct costs and, questioning them, because costs are reimbursable if they're allowable, allocable, and reasonable. And a solution that again, when I first was involved in cost reimbursement contracts, that location did a very good job. We demanded as part of our contract language that the contractor submit itemized vouchers to concurrently, even when they were approved for direct submission to either DCMA or DCAA, either case, or to the payment office, that we would still demand these itemized vouchers, not for the indirect costs. We clearly understood that was a DCMA responsibility at that point in time, or DCAA. It was between them from our perspective, but we would demand those vouchers showing the itemized direct costs, and it was our job to review those and question them. And I remember overhearing a conversation of one particular contract officer who actually sat on the other side of me, from where Don Acquisition sat on one side of me, and this particular contract officer sat on the other side of me, and she was contacting the contractor, and she said, well, this other direct costs is $2 million, and I need a list of it. I don't think it was 2 million, but it was a large amount of money, and it should have been itemized. And so after several conversations, she finally had a list of these itemized costs in this other direct cost category, and she then proceeded to say on this conversation, once she had the itemized list, that she says, well, I don't understand why you need 50 pairs of steel-toed boots to write software code. And so it was clearly a cost that should not really have been there. And, and for me, that's an excellent example of someone doing their job and questioning costs that shouldn't have been there. And I'm sure, to be honest, the contractor did buy steel-toed boots somewhere, but they probably didn't buy it for that particular contract. So that was probably more of a question of allocability than maybe allowability. But either way, it was not allowable in that contract. But I think that's really the larger underlying issue here, is who in all of DoD is double checking that these direct costs are in fact appropriate and reasonable.
So isn't that done at closeout? Like when you do the audit at closeout, don't they look at direct costs, or is that just, no, they don't? So you would only catch that by reviewing vouchers.
Not or
Okay.
Don. Not a changed. Things have changed. So things changed. So
Yeah, I was going to say, my experience
Jennifer,
was
you wanna say something?
even way back in the first part of my career. So we're going back 15 to 18 years ago. I remember having a conversation with DCAA of their review of direct costs. And at that time, DCAA very clearly said to me, oh no, we don't look at those basically ever. That's like your job. So I was horrified by that.
On invoices?
Not direct costs. Yeah, they would look at invoices or make sure they added up, but they didn't question whether they were appropriate to that contract or even, reasonable or whatever. And so that was a big eye opener for me.
I kind of assumed somebody was doing that.
Well, I did too, which is why when I had that, it was a cost reimbursement contract we ended up having to terminate. It was like one of those weird things that you learn a lot more from than you realize and you appreciate later that you had to go through it. But yeah, that was one of the side learning points, was DCAA doesn't really look at direct costs.
So Nick, you said things have changed. So we used to look at direct costs? Okay.
let's talk about. Yeah, let's talk about that. So number one, DCA does do voucher reviews, right? If you have a progress payment fixed price contract, they're going to look almost guaranteed at your first progress payment request. Check out things like loss ratios and are you doing it? And they do. And if you're any kind of size contractor, they're going to look at your invoices on a stat sample type of basis. But this notion that it's, if you're KBR in Southwest Asia, yeah, everything is under heavy scrutiny all the time. But if you're the average Joe contractor, nah, and even at closeout, there are these schedules now, cumulative allowable cost worksheet, final vouchers. They do have some review, right? But here's the kicker that we haven't talked about, and I think it's a great way to end this podcast: statute of limitations, right? All this IG stuff they're talking about, 90% of these unsettled or mistakenly settled CAFU audit reports, it's too late. 6 years has passed, right? And courts have held that the statute of limitations starts running when the government approves the invoice for payment. It starts running on direct cost when it's approved for payment. 6 years from that day, you don't get to assert a claim. You're done, government, right? So this is the thing that needs to be addressed. And that's why DCAA falling behind on their incurred cost audits, which, as the Section 809 panel makes clear in the point that's up, is it's not called an incurred cost audit, or it shouldn't be. It should be called a final billing rate proposal audit, but never mind that. Everyone calls them incurred cost audit. When they fell behind, the government started missing the statute of limitations, right? The clock started running out on the government. And that put a lot of fear into a lot of people, mostly lawyers in CAOs, that the government was going to lose its right to assert a claim if they found costs that were questioned. So this is a big thing here, is when you, contracting officer and contracting officer representative, you say that direct voucher is good to be paid, it's adequate for payment, we've reviewed it, we don't have any problem with it. Okay, that's the review. There may be other reviews on a stat sample basis, but there was a court case 3 years ago called Spartan de Leon Springs. And the court said that's contracting officer question costs on the final invoice that were direct cost. And the court threw it out. No, it's been 8 years since these vouchers were submitted. You don't have a claim anymore. Your clock is expired. So we got to talk about that. Who's reviewing it and who's reviewing it timely? I guess what the government has 7 days to review and determine a voucher is adequate, and then another 29 days to pay it, or 26 days to pay it, whatever the numbers are. That's the time the government has. That's when it has to be done.
So like for interim vouchers on a cost reimbursement contract that go direct to DCAA, they're not looking at direct costs. Or they sample it.
I was told by DCAA that no, they don't. They'll look to see if they're not itemized, they don't demand that they be itemized, and if they are itemized, they basically just check to see if they add up to the total that was on there. That was the discussion I had even many years ago, and this was before the big audit. And then DCAA got to the point where they weren't even accepting contracts for audit that were less than 100 million. So they kind of tried to fob all that on to DCMA, who was already understaffed. And so basically you have a situation right now, for lack of a better way to say it, where nobody's looking at this as a general rule.
Nick, would this potentially be discovered during like a billing system review or some kind of accounting system review?
Well, so first of all, DCA does trace the amounts in the voucher to the amounts on the contractor's books. Okay, that is happening when they do a voucher review, or I call a book to build reconciliation. They do it, but they don't opine on the allowability of the cost. They just do the mathematical test. And then, Don, to your point, yes, when somebody does an accounting system review, the opinion is the contractor's accounting system is adequate for the contract type, let's say cost reimbursement work. That means the contractor has adequate internal controls to provide reasonable assurance that unallowable costs are being identified and segregated and not billed to the government customer.
So I guess I'm wondering, is that good enough, or do we need to do more? Like if we spend more resources on reviewing direct costs, would that be worth the time? Or is the risk that we're taking right now okay?
Well, I think if you ask the IG,
there's money to be found. Well,
you're on mute, Jennifer.
Oh, sorry. If we ask the IG, I think we need more resources. And my own personal experience with reviewing the costs with the people that reviewed the costs is it is worth that time and effort. But I think what's worth more time and effort is more adequately defining our requirements so that they can, in fact, appropriately be competed on a fixed price basis.
What do you think, Nick?
So to answer the question, yeah, I think there's money to be found.
No, I didn't know.
You guys know that DCA is all caught up on their incurred cost audit backlog, so to speak, right? You know that. That's why they can do work for non-DoD agencies. But how they caught up is a story, and it's one that I actually documented on my blog as it evolved. They caught up by determining a certain amount of these proposals they just weren't going to audit, right? They just decided, okay, these are low-risk proposals, not enough bang for the buck. So here's a letter to you, contracting officer. Mathematically, the rates tie out. We're expressing no opinion on whether they contain allowable or unallowable costs. But if you want to look deeper, that's on you. We're done. We're out of here because we don't have the resources, and Congress is on our case for our ginormous backlog. And so we're just, that to me is the scandal waiting to be discovered, is what percentage of government spend or Department of Defense spend never gets audited by the auditors.
Oh, I definitely felt it was an issue for the hundreds of millions, which I'm sure was billions over the years of funds that were in my purview, particularly in my stint at the Army. And that's what I say, like when I was like, well, nobody's looking at these costs, and how does anyone know that this is a prudent expenditure of funds? And the answer is nobody does. And so of course the more cynical part of me says that maybe the whole function of government contracting is to just pump money into the economy, so it doesn't really matter what kind of value we get for the money, but the altruistic, somebody should be looking at this part of me says, yeah, there needs to be much more eyeballs on what's getting audited, who's making those decisions, that concept.
All right, I'll end with a funny story about like old contracts that needed audits and they were neglected and all that. So I worked with somebody. I'm not going to name the place they worked at before they worked with me at DAU. But they had inherited a bunch of contracts from a base that closed down. And this palette of contracts needed to be closed out. And there was no record of the contracts in any automated system. Okay? The only record of the contracts was in a paper system. To close these contracts out would have taken like a mountain of resources and effort. But there was an incinerator on the base. So, so one day the pallet mysteriously went away. And it was this person's idea to make use of the incinerator. So I guess we'll never know how many question costs would have come out of that.
Well, look,